This is a bombshell expose, which destroys one of the great lies of Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people. And it is such an important lie that is being exposed here because it was used to keep Israel's genocide going, not least by willfully deceiving the American people. It's an investigation by Israel's Channel 13. That's in Hebrew, but it's been helpfully translated by the ever-brilliant Dropsite News. And this investigation confirms what many of us knew to be the case, which is that Joe Biden's administration never pressured Israel into accepting a ceasefire, despite public claims that this is what they were doing. The investigation cites 9 officials from the Biden administration. It also cites the Israeli ambassador to the US at the time, Michael Herzog, who is quoted saying the following: "God did the state of Israel a favor that Biden was the president during this period. We fought in Gaza for over a year and the administration never came to us and said ceasefire now. It never did. And that's not to be taken for granted." Ilan Goldenberg, who was a senior national security aide, says of the refusal of Israeli officials to have a so-called day after Hamas is removed strategy, "If they're never going to do this, it doesn't matter what the outcome is. Hamas is still going to control Gaza. You're just killing and destroying for the sake of killing and destroying, but you're not building an alternative." Now, it should be obvious, by the way, that Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu, who is subject to an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity, didn't have a so-called day after plan for Gaza because he actually was committed to killing and destroying for the sake of killing and destroying. That's his strategy. As an article for the Israeli news source Ynet revealed last month, when at the beginning of the genocide, Israel's army chief of staff presented a list of 1,500 targets in Gaza to destroy, Netanyahu reportedly erupted in anger, yelling and banging on the table. "Why not 5,000? He scolded the chief of staff. "We don't have 5,000 approved targets," is what the chief of staff responded with. "I'm not interested in targets," Netanyahu retorted. "Take down houses, bomb with everything you have." Furthermore, in a speech at the end of last month, Netanyahu declared, "The second claim, that we are unwilling to discuss the final stage. This is also incorrect. We are willing. Hamas will lay down its weapons, its leaders will be allowed to leave. We will see to the general security in the Gaza Strip and will allow the realization of the Trump plan for voluntary migration. This is the plan. We're not hiding this and are ready to discuss it at any time." In other words, Netanyahu is committed to emptying Gaza of its population, an inherently genocidal act made possible as he sees it by making Gaza unlivable. In the Channel 13 investigation, as Dropsite News summarise it, US officials pushed a post-war plan modelled on the anti-ISIS campaign, proposing that Arab states temporarily secure Gaza, but Netanyahu blocked it, refusing any role for the Palestinian Authority. Now, the far-right ministers, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, of course, as the investigation says, were openly pushing and have been throughout for reoccupying Gaza and rebuilding settlements. Netanyahu refused to advance alternatives, keeping the door open to their demands. Well, this is Netanyahu clearly playing a game of plausible deniability. In Louis Theroux's excellent new documentary about Israeli settlers, he interviews Daniela Weiss, the far-right leader of Israel's settlers, who refers to Netanyahu describing Israeli settlements in Gaza as not realistic last June, but how she saw her role as making such proposals realistic, clearly as an outrider for the government. And indeed, that was before Netanyahu signed up to the Trump ethnic cleansing plan. Now, I think it's just worth just taking a step back here because the US was very aware, the US administration, that Israel was slaughtering for its own sake. I mean, a genocide, that's what you do. You empty or destroy. You destroy any distinction between the civilian population and those you classify as your military targets, which is what Israel did from the beginning. I mean, they made that very clear in public statements made by Israeli leaders and officials. They were slaughtering, butchering, starving as an end in itself. They've always regarded the Palestinian people as a problem, which is an existential threat to the Israeli project. They would rather the Palestinian people weren't there. They work backwards from that on the basis of what is politically possible at any given time. You know, what space do they have in order to act on their wishes to find a way to just get rid of the Palestinians. Now, they were butchering and slaughtering the Palestinians, and the US administration were aware of the extermination, the just wiping Gaza from the face of the earth. They were aware of all of that, and they didn't stop it. They chose not to stop it. They could have put pressure on Israel to stop it, and they didn't. That's important. Well, it exposes what is criminal, not just complicity. It makes it sound like, they just kind of went along with it. This is a US Israeli genocide. I really think we have to start thinking about it in those terms. Now, the investigation also underlined how Netanyahu was deliberately preventing any peace deal which would secure the release of the hostages. Bring them home. That's what we were told, weren't we? Bring them home. Ilan Goldenberg stating, I would get a lot of whispers from old Israeli friends who said all the security people are coming out and saying Netanyahu is undercutting it every step of the way. I started to believe it when there's so much coming out saying that he's clearly a problem, whereas some of my colleagues didn't see it. Goldenberg also states that there were discussions about Biden giving a speech to put pressure on Israel, including pushing for new elections, but Biden backed off. Now, if Israel wanted to get their hostages back, they could have done it. I mean, at the very beginning, the proposal was offered, which, just to be clear, obviously hostage taking full stop is a war crime, whoever does it. And that includes the Israeli state, who have taken thousands. Well, actually, they've taken far more before this, but at the moment they've taken thousands of Palestinians hostages. Hamas offered to release all the hostages at the beginning if Israel didn't occupy Gaza. And we know that the only way we've got mass releases of Israeli hostages is through ceasefire and swaps, including of Palestinian hostages. Now, those attempts to get a deal to secure, which would have been a good thing to get Israeli hostages back in exchange, of course, for Palestinian detainees being released. But Netanyahu stopped that from happening because he wasn't interested in a lasting peace settlement, which would secure the release of those hostages. And that's why he derailed it at every step of the way. Now, the investigation also underlines how the US covered for Israeli war crimes. Stacey Gilbert was a State Department advisor. She resigned because she was cut out of the process of drafting a legally required arms compliance report, with the final version finding overwhelming evidence of aid obstruction. Gilbert said it was shocking in its mendacity, adding, everyone knows that it is not true. Indeed, as it's noted in the investigation, even as settlers looted Gaza-bound trucks and Israel blocked humanitarian aid, Biden certified compliance and kept weapons flowing. A crucial point here, last autumn, a report in ProPublica found that 2 US government agencies, USAID and the State Department's Refugee Agency, had concluded that Israel was deliberately blocking humanitarian aid last April. Under US law, the US administration was therefore legally required to stop arms sales to Israel, but the Biden administration overruled that law. The investigation goes on that Biden officials revealed Netanyahu deliberately tanked negotiations, fearing a deal would force him to end the war. Well, indeed. Damningly, it goes on. American-Israeli hostage Hirsch Goldenberg Poland was scheduled to be added to the release list the day he was executed. Amos Hochstein confirmed there's no doubt those hostages would be alive. Obviously, if those attempts to secure a deal were not derailed by the Israeli government, with the complicity of the US administration. As the investigation also underlined, it was how Biden stood by Netanyahu even as he was undermined and humiliated. To quote, Biden once told Netanyahu he was full of shit and hung up the phone call mid-call. But as Ambassador Tom Nides put it, Biden saw Netanyahu as a manipulator and magician, but he stood by him through the end. So let's rewind, shall we, to what Joe Biden's vice president and Democratic presidential candidate in the election, Kamala Harris, said last August.
So let me say, I have been clear. Now is the time to get a ceasefire deal and get the hostage deal done. Now is the time. And the president and I are working around the clock every day to get that ceasefire deal done and bring the hostages home. So I respect your voices, but we are here to now talk about this race in 2024.
So, to be clear, she said, the president and I are working around the clock every day to get that ceasefire deal done and bring the hostages home. She was lying. Lying through her teeth. Lying to the American people. A barefaced total lie. She and Joe Biden weren't working around the clock every day to get the hostages home. They didn't put any meaningful pressure on Netanyahu's regime to agree to a ceasefire whatsoever. The truth is that Joe Biden is a convinced pro-Israel zealot. That's the reality. Let's listen to Joe Biden and listen to what he said when he was a Democratic senator in 1986.
If we look at the Middle East, I think it's about time we stop, those of us who support, as most of us do, Israel in this body, for apologizing for our support for Israel. There's no apology to be made. None. It is the best $3 billion investment we make. Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region. The United States would have to go out and invent an Israel.
Well, those words are very important because they reveal how Joe Biden and the US elite see Israel. He wasn't using standard Zionist phraseology about Jewish homeland and all the rest. He was talking about Israel as a strategic asset to US power in the Middle East. A strategic asset so important that if it didn't exist, then the US would need to invent it. This is indeed the US position, and it's why successive US presidents have let Israel get away with mass murder and the hideous injustices it imposes on the Palestinians. That includes anti-Semites, by the way, like the former President Richard Nixon. But here's what's so damning about Joe Biden. Yes, it's true that US presidents have consistently seen Israel just as Joe Biden candidly described it back in 1986. But Biden is particularly slavish in his support. When Israel was invading Lebanon in 1982, the right-wing US Republican president, Ronald Reagan, was so horrified by the carnage being inflicted by Israeli forces that he rang the Israeli Prime Minister to order him to stop what he described as a Holocaust. And that carnage was hideous, but I'm afraid to say it wasn't even a fraction of the genocidal carnage unleashed by Israel since 7th of October. Since the genocide began, we did occasionally hear hand-wringing from Joe Biden and his allies in public, but it was clearly for one thing alone: domestic consumption, not to put pressure on Israel. Indeed, the polling showed that by a very big margin, Democratic voters thought Israel was committing genocide. They were trying to keep Democratic voters on side by making them think that there was a lesser of two evils, that secretly the US administration was putting pressure on Israel, but it was doing no such thing. All of this, nonetheless, had profound consequences. As research by the Institute for Middle East Understanding found in January, for those voters who opted for Joe Biden in 2020 and then didn't vote for Kamala Harris last year, 29% said the reason for that was ending Israel's violence in Gaza. The fact is, Israel's genocide would never have been possible without Joe Biden and his administration. They handed Israel approaching $30 billion worth of arms after the 7th of October, offered diplomatic support, regurgitated Israeli lies, covered for war crimes. We could go on. It's important that history records what they did, and also that we fight for the Biden administration to be hauled before the courts for the crime they facilitated, however unrealistic that may seem in the here and now. Please like and subscribe, leave your thoughts and your comments. Help us take on the pro-genocide media at patreon.com/ownjoes84. Listen to the podcast, share the video. I'll speak to you in a bit.